That's one thing I always include in my classes, is because it is important that we recognize our own responses and how this work as first responders impacts us. So having those conversations and bringing it back home for them is really powerful too. But we need to be having that with the people who are considering going into these professions. They need to be prepared in a different way than we ever prepared. We need to stop losing people to suicide and high rates of divorce and alcoholism, because we're not preparing them for their own trauma.
One of those light bulb moments, I think, for our state was last month when we had our statewide working group meeting, and we brought in Dr. Valentine, who will be presenting to us tomorrow on a little bit of her research and what she's finding in our data as a state. And hearing from the law enforcement officers that they had never seen the data before, they didn't understand how the work that they were doing was impacting our state and how it was impacting victims. And actually seeing those data breakdowns, what are your thoughts on bringing data to law enforcement? Does that speak to law enforcement? How do we present that data and those things that we're learning and feed those back into our program?
I think anything that can help law enforcement understand their piece of the puzzle and how it impacts the rest of the puzzle is crucial. I hear oftentimes about, I'll hear law enforcement, just like the rest of us do, right? Well, I can learn all this, but the prosecutors aren't doing this. I can do all this, and the judges aren't doing this. And so I always say to them, the information that you're taking in, when you're looking at your piece of the puzzle, you can either be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. You can complain all day long, or you can share the information, you can share the training opportunities, you can share the data, and be willing to be kind of transparent and take a hard look at yourself and your own organization. When we did our gender bias initiative, the lack of documentation in stalking was glaring. The many times we documented it, we didn't write it down and investigate it and go forward with it. Like, the documentation was there, we weren't identifying it. And with sexual assault and domestic violence and stalking, there's so much co-occurrence with those crimes and understanding that. So I think that's just key that people understand that.
I think it has been a bit of a painful journey, at least from an outsider's perspective, for law enforcement. When I watched people going through the KIT audit and going through their records like you talked about a minute ago, but also doing some of this training. You mentioned having a hard time going through those files, and I was here and I wish I would have been here. I think those are difficult things.
Yep, but you know what? They're incredibly important things, because one of the things I tell people when I train is I pride myself on being a really good cop. I have pride in being a good investigator and doing what's right for people, and to look back on those lessons learned and the chances I had to make a difference that I didn't, or did more harm than good, which is absolutely should never be our goal. Those are important moments for us to have, because we can't move forward in improving things if we always stay in the status quo and we don't take a look at what we're doing.
I love that. And I think law enforcement is in such a different place than even a couple years ago.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the things I also really highlight, and I've seen this throughout my career, when we're given the tools, when we're given the knowledge, when we're given the information, in the entire criminal justice system, law enforcement is the first to change. They're the first to make the effort. They're the first to kind of grab hold of that and try and bring it in and apply it, if we're providing it to them. And I think that's been a downfall for a while, is that information wasn't out there for them.
But they're making use of it now.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And I love hearing about it. I love hearing somebody who sends me an email and says, I attended your training. I just had a conversation this morning with a detective from Pennsylvania who was on a strangulation training I did last month. And he wanted to talk to me about a homicide class, and he was going over all these things that I talked about in class he's a homicide detective. He did not know. And he, just was rethinking his case. And I love that. That's how we grow and evolve and improve on our work.
I think that's the focus of this symposium today and tomorrow is improvement, and making ourselves better, both
Yeah.
here in Idaho and as a country. How do we do better?
Yeah.
How do we address these issues in a serious and
Yep.
mindful way?
Yeah. And always keep in mind, always in our forefront, is who are we doing this for? Who are we serving? Why do we want best practices? Why do we want to be the best in the state? Why do we want to be the best in what we're doing with the state lab? Because these are very traumatic situations, and anybody who experiences that deserves all of us to put our best foot forward.
Thanks, Angela.
Yep.
There is a lot of vicarious trauma, so people who get into it, even with the best intentions, often burn out after a couple years, and it's completely understandable just because of the nature of what we do and what we see on a regular basis.
So perhaps for those who are listening who don't work in this field, can you talk a little bit about what vicarious trauma is and why that's a risk for the nursing staff?
Sure. So when we go to exams for people who have been traumatized, whether they have been raped or a victim of domestic violence or abuse, or kiddos, like we take on, whether we mean to or not, a piece of that trauma. So we vicariously take on a bit of their trauma into ourselves. And if we don't have the appropriate skills to manage that, then it just builds and builds and builds. And all of a sudden their trauma is now our trauma, and we can't differentiate the two. And then we can no longer effectively do our job for our people because everything they feel, we feel. And then we are not helpful in them starting their road to recovery. And we can't stay impartial to do the job that we need to do on a forensic level.
And so it's really important for anyone thinking about looking at this position to understand it's vital that we take care of our own mental health in order, as you say, to continue taking care of those who need us.
Very much so.
What is some of the education that you provide for your staff?
One, I have the experience, so I was a detective before that, so part of it is I've had that experience and sat in as a detective and went through a lot of classes on not only domestic violence, but up to sexual assault training for children and adults, and what to do, traumatic-based interviewing techniques, and I make sure all the detectives, all the brand new detectives, go to a class for trauma-based interviewing, sexual assaults, and also how to interview the suspects, because that's a whole unique thing to get somebody to tell you, if you will, their sexual endeavors, which is personal and can be embarrassing, so it's hard to get a lot of them to state what happened.
Our law enforcement is very committed to caring for these victims, but they didn't know. They're trained to recognize deception. But for years and years and years, none of us have known that the patient who has experienced trauma, whether it's from sexual assault, watching a horrific crime, any like that, how they will present based on how the neurology in their brain functions and changes during trauma actually looks exactly like deception. And so our law enforcement officers are really embracing this and saying, wow, we just didn't know. And so to have them step forward, like you say, training hundreds of them, and then I see them, because when I do the SANE A classes, the last day I have local speakers in, so the local prosecutor and local law enforcement. And it is really gratifying to see them come in and say, I just took the training with Angela, and wow, that was really amazing, and I'm going back and we're working on this, and we're going to change how we address some of these issues.
What we have is a federal STOP grant. We have that grant to be able to fund your position for now. But I think other than that, we have gone after funding to be able to staff, well, not necessarily staff, but to equip those rooms. So tell us a little bit about that program and how we use those grant funds.
Absolutely, and my predecessor did an amazing job with that, really researching what was needed and contacting all of the hospitals to say, would you use this cart? And so we actually provide a cart. Looks like a toolbox, only a little nicer looking. And in that, then we've provided a DSLR camera with the equipment that they need for that, as far as a macro lens, swab dryers that go along with that, and just making sure that they know what needs to be in there. We provided T-blue, the toluidine dye initially, and then we do expect them to replace that. We've given them where they can order that. So contacting every one of those hospitals and saying, here is the cart, here are all of the contents, here's a list, and when you run out of the disposables, here's where you can get those if you need to order those. So that, I think, also helps. My goal, and I think our goal at ISP, is to improve access to standardized care. So really looking at those NIJ and SAFER guidelines, those recommendations, incorporating those into our Idaho guidelines that the ISAKI group has written, and getting those out across the state. So having those carts has made a difference because they're all set up the same. All that information that we provide to them on how to do the collection is the same. So getting out, and occasionally when I go through, I'll stop at various hospitals. If I'm going to Coeur d'Alene, I have a long drive from here to there, and I can stop at several places and say, hey, do you still have your equipment? Can you show me? When I first started, sometimes it really was a scramble. They're like, do we have one of those? And now it's like, oh yeah, here's our cart, and as these people are trained, they're able to use it, and we're seeing it put into place, and so that's been a highly successful program as well, just keeping track of everything that we've sent out.
It was astonishing to me and almost demoralizing to me, the lack of equipment and
Absolutely.
supplies that some of these programs had. Literally, when they don't have evidence bags or envelopes or swabs, some of those things that we look to provide in that early kit, in essence, that we provided. I mean, it was fun for me. I drove the state and delivered some of these things directly to the nurses and to the clinics, and kind of felt like Christmas as we delivered them. And they were so appreciative to have a camera.
Right.
I mean, things that we think are so simple, to have bags. It seems so simple to us, and we use grant funding for it, and we're grateful for the grant funding from the federal government that allowed us to do that. But it seems so simple, yet it really wasn't for some of these hospitals.
Another perfect example of that teamwork, right? That the hospitals struggle. Reimbursement is just shrinking dollars every single day, and administrators are having to make terribly minute decisions. How on earth can we care for our community with this shrinking base of dollars? And so for the state to be able to come in and say, here's what you need to run this program, that was huge. And I can tell you as a nursing director, the funds for a good DSLR camera, I'm going to have to be giving up some other equipment. And sometimes when you say, well, we only may, some of our smaller communities, maybe we only see 3 or 4 sexual assaults in a year. Can I really justify spending that money when I can spend it over here on something that we're going to use at least weekly and possibly daily? So that was an extremely wise move on the part of ISAKI to identify that getting that basic equipment as a starting spot really would help with the success of these programs. And that also is another difficult decision. How do we, when you take a look at the requirements of a SANE nurse, that you're pulling one nurse from staffing for 4 to 6 hours, and they cannot be disturbed, regardless of how many ambulances are now pulling up in your bay, that nurse is essentially gone. And in our smaller hospitals, if you only got 1 or 2 nurses maybe staffed in your ER, it's a true hardship to pull a nurse away from that. And so I know that there were a lot of really difficult discussions saying, okay, this would be great, but how logistically are we going to be able to do that? And to see these organizations step up and say, we're going to make it work. I know a couple of our smaller places have literally 2 people that are covering 24/7 around the clock all year long. And they're desperate to get help, but it's hard to even get. This year, unfortunately, we had 8 classes scheduled across the state, and because of staffing, as the nation has struggled, it's not just Idaho, they've had to cancel them. And it's a real conundrum because they desperately want nurses trained, that in several places have nurses waiting and wanting the training, and just needing to keep nurses at the bedside has put a little bit of a crimp in that. So fortunately, all of them have rescheduled for 2022, and we're hoping that staffing will improve. But you're right, that's a huge issue. It isn't just here's your equipment, really trying to figure out how do we pull that nurse for a procedure that is a long-term procedure. In nursing, we multitask so well. I'm going to start with this patient. Oh, excuse me, Matthew, I'll be right back. I'm right in the middle of taking care of you, but someone more important just came in, or sicker, not necessarily more important, but sicker. We don't do that with SANE. They are the one priority of that nurse. They cannot be pulled away. And so that's a whole shift in how you think about providing that care, and it's difficult to do. What kind of things do we typically see when those kids come in, Raylene?
When the sexual assault kits come in, we usually receive the kit itself. If there are any known reference samples in the case, if there's an identified suspect, or if the victim had a consensual partner within 96 hours of the assault, we will also request samples from that individual. Every once in a while there will be additional evidence like a condom or hand swabs from the suspect as well.
Great. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how that testing for DNA is done as those kits come in? What exactly is our process?
Sure. When kits are received in the laboratory, they go through our evidence receipt process and are then checked out by analysts in that section. Currently, we are performing what is called Y-screen on the majority of our kits. So if the victim is a gender assigned at birth female and the suspect or assailant is a gender assigned at birth male, then we will perform the Y-screen process. And what that is testing looking specifically for male DNA. It's a quicker process than the traditional serology, and in our experience is a more sensitive process, so we have more samples from these kits going forward for DNA analysis. We test every single swab in the kit as part of this screening process, so that's another advantage, is every swab is being tested.
We love seeing all of the collaboration and information sharing happening in the chat right now. And in that spirit, it's time for some more discussion. Matthew, the floor is yours.
I agree. I just saw a message posted in the chat from Crystal, and she's expressing appreciation to people sharing resources and giving her information. That is what this is about. It's a peer-to-peer event, and we're grateful to see all this great discussion, collaboration. We want to see more. We will share out everything that we've got. We'll work with our partners at FTCOE to get some things that have been requested out there, but please feel free to contact us and others that are posting their information in the chat. I'm going to go first to Raylene Nowlin, the laboratory manager in Meridian. And Raylene, the question coming in from Mark is, it's a question about not testing versus not submitting VAWA kits. So tell us a little bit more for those who are new to the VAWA discussion, what that is, how it works in our state, and if you're concerned about the evidence preservation.
VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act. It's a federal act. It allows women or victims, it could be male victims of sexual assault, to come forward, have evidence collected as a Jane or John Doe, meaning they don't want to report to law enforcement. There may be circumstances in their life that it's not, they want the evidence collected, but they aren't willing or ready to come forward to law enforcement at that time. And per our state statute, those samples or those kits do not come in for collection. I should mention our state statute is specific to adults. Juveniles cannot, per our state statute, have an anonymous kit collection. And as far as I saw some of the questions in the chat specific to toxicology samples, our sexual assault kits do not actually contain any sex or toxicology samples. They don't contain any liquid blood or liquid urine samples. Those are collected in a separate kit collection. As far as storage of those evidence items until they are submitted for testing, we do make available best practice guidelines for storage of evidence to maintain those samples long term.
Thanks, Raylene. Really important considerations coming in there. Deb, another question coming in from Gabriella about intoxication.
And a great question. Gabriella wants to know, what do you do if a patient comes in intoxicated? Don't they have to be sober to have an exam? No, they don't. Just like other healthcare, it's not uncommon for nurses to take care of patients who are inebriated. What they do have to be able to do is have capacity to consent. So that means I have, as the same nurse, I have to really talk with this patient and evaluate whether or not I feel that she can understand the options I am giving her, and she understands the implications, as we talked earlier about the risks and the benefits. And if I choose not to report, what could this mean if I decide to open an investigation down the road? So I will do that assessment. And there's been a lot of talk around our state is what happens if she comes in and I'm talking to her, she just kind of dozing off, obviously she doesn't have capacity. If she can't hold a conversation with me, then she's not capable of giving consent. And so we talk about, do we let her sleep it off there in the ER? And that's one of those times when it comes down to, this is an organization decision. This isn't a state decision that we say, this is how you're going to handle it. Each organization in the state has to decide how they're going to take care of that intoxicated patient. But that's for any intoxicated patient, not just necessarily a patient with sexual assault. So no, they do not have to be stone cold sober. We just have to make sure that they really truly understand what we're asking of them and that they're cooperative, that they really do want it done.
Fantastic. Casey's asking a question about clothing for survivors. And I noticed that another one of our collaborators, Paige Dinger from Faces of Hope in Boise, who is, again, a phenomenal facility where survivors can go for a number of resources. They are a self-contained facility containing law enforcement, prosecutors, and others. A great example of a way to do this right. And Paige is posting in that they have Hope's Closet, is what they call it, where a survivor can go, male, female, children, and shop for items with tags still on them, brand new items, where they, in all shapes and sizes, and they can access that clothing before they return to their homes. I also wanted to throw that question out to Tina. Tina, are you able to still be with us and hear us?
I am. Each facility is going to be set up a little differently. What we have is we have donated sweats and stuff that are available at, again, because not all of our services, not all of our nurses are going to be doing exams here at DVSAC. So available at any of the hospitals that we respond to, they're going to have clothing there that that patient can look at and utilize. Sometimes patients will have another support person there that can go home and pick up clothing and bring it back to them, because they're just like, no, I want my own stuff. I don't want anybody else's stuff. So it's really going to be based on what they're wanting to do at that particular point in time.
Fantastic. We would encourage you to continue to post in your questions. We'll continue to answer them as they come in. We're going to toss it back to Tyler